It was a sweltering afternoon in 1968 at Long Binh, the sprawling American logistics hub in Vietnam that felt like the beating heart of the war effort. Soldiers from every branch crammed into the mess hall, a rare oasis amid the chaos of mud, machinery, and endless patrols. Laughter echoed off the tin walls as Green Berets swapped stories with Navy corpsmen and MACV advisors, their trays loaded with whatever passed for a hot meal. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of camaraderie, a brief escape from the jungle's unrelenting grip. But in an instant, that normalcy shattered like glass under a boot. A lone Australian soldier appeared in the doorway. No fanfare, no visible insignia, just a figure that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The room didn't freeze all at once. It started with one table, a seasoned Green Beret mid-bite, who set his fork down silently and stood. Then another group followed, a corpsman pushing his untouched plate aside. Within seconds, chairs scraped back, meals abandoned, as elite warriors, men who'd faced ambushes and firefights without flinching, filed out quietly, leaving a growing void around the newcomer. No words were spoken, no glares exchanged. It was as if an invisible force had cleared the space, turning the bustling hall into an echo chamber of unease. Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, a battle-hardened veteran with years in country, watched it unfold with a knot in his gut. He'd shared foxholes with fierce Korean troops and stoic Montagnard scouts, but this was different. This wasn't fear or rivalry, it was a deliberate distance, a recognition that carried weight. As the Australian sat alone, opening a ration pack with mechanical precision, Kowalski leaned toward an intelligence master sergeant nearby. "What's the deal?" he whispered. The reply came low and matter-of-fact, "Australian SAS from Nui Dat, the ones they call the Phantom Hunters." That simple phrase unlocked it all. These weren't just allies, they were operators who'd rewritten the rules of warfare in ways that made even America's top fighters step back. The men who'd left the hall that day weren't fleeing danger, they were preserving a fragile boundary. Because getting too close meant glimpsing methods so potent, so unorthodox, that they challenged everything the U.S. military stood for. And once you saw the truth behind their success, you couldn't unsee it. It forced a reckoning. If their approach worked this flawlessly, why weren't we all doing it? The answer hung in the air like unspoken orders, because some victories came at a cost too steep for doctrine to bear. That fleeting moment in the mess hall captured a deeper divide rippling through the Allied effort in Vietnam. By 1968, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, based out of Nui Dat in Phuoc Thi Province, had etched a record into the annals of special operations that bordered on the improbable. Operating in small teams of 4 or 5, they racked up over 500 confirmed enemy eliminations through patrols and ambushes, all while suffering 0 combat losses in those same missions. Not minimized risks or fortunate odds, absolute 0. In a conflict where American Special Forces, despite superior numbers and technology, grappled with attrition rates that ground down even the elite, this disparity wasn't just notable, it was revolutionary. U.S. Green Berets and MACV-SOG teams, backed by helicopter fleets, artillery barrages, and vast supply chains, typically achieved kill ratios of 8-to-1 to 12-to-1, often paying dearly in return. Extrapolate those figures to the Australians' relentless operational pace, and their entire unit should have been decimated multiple times over. Yet, they emerged unscathed, their effectiveness sending shockwaves through classified briefings. Analysts at MACV headquarters couldn't dismiss it as luck or terrain. Side-by-side comparisons of operations in similar jungle zones against identical foes revealed stark contrasts. While U.S. units pursued aggressive search-and-destroy sweeps, mobilizing battalions and unleashing overwhelming firepower, the Australians opted for subtlety and endurance. Their patrols vanished into the bush for days, sometimes weeks, with minimal gear and no routine support. This wasn't the high-tempo warfare Americans were trained for, it was a patient immersion that turned the environment into an ally. The results. In Phuoc Thi, enemy movements ground to a halt. Viet Cong supply lines faltered, tax collections ceased, and main force units issued directives to evade Australian patrols at all costs. Captured documents painted a picture of dread, zones labeled as areas of unseen hunters, where the jungle itself seemed hostile. Neighboring provinces under American oversight saw the insurgency rebound time and again, but in Phuoc Thai, it atrophied, creating pockets of relative stability that baffled commanders. A 1969 internal assessment commissioned by MACV delved into this enigma, scrutinizing Allied Special Operations Forces. The findings, couched in measured prose, were unequivocal. Australian tactics yielded outcomes U.S. doctrine couldn't match. Factors like terrain or enemy strength didn't account for the gap. American units actually held advantages in resources and firepower. The secret lay in adaptation, a philosophy honed from earlier conflicts like the Malayan Emergency, where Australians mastered counterinsurgency through small, self-reliant teams. Unlike U.S. methods, which emphasized dominance through scale and technology, the SAS embraced the jungle's rhythm. Insertions happened at dusk, followed by hours of stillness, not rest, but observation. They attuned to the baseline symphony of the wild, bird patterns, insect choruses, the subtle sway of foliage. Any anomaly signaled intrusion, allowing them to detect foes long before being spotted. Movement became an art form of deception. Footsteps were probed inch by inch, leaves parted gently, paths avoided to mimic natural flow. Tracking skills, drawn from collaborations with indigenous Australian experts whose ancestors read the land for millennia, elevated this to mastery. A bent twig revealed recent passage, soil indentations betrayed weight and direction, even disrupted insect trails whispered secrets. SAS teams didn't blunder into contacts, they orchestrated them, shadowing enemy groups for days to map habits and weaknesses. This patience unnerved American observers accustomed to swift action and extraction. Where U.S. patrols covered ground rapidly, Australians progressed in whispers, turning time into a weapon. The payoff was evident in operations like those during the Tet Offensive, where SAS reconnaissance disrupted VC infiltrations without fanfare, or in extended ambushes that neutralized threats before they materialized. But effectiveness extended beyond physical prowess into the psychological realm. Australian patrols aimed not just for engagements but for erosion, sowing doubt that unraveled enemy cohesion from within. Selective actions, timed for maximum ripple, left lingering questions. Why did isolated runners vanish without trace? How did secure camps feel exposed? The intent was to foster uncertainty, prompting VC units to question their own ranks, suspecting betrayal where none existed. This internal fracturing amplified impacts, as paranoia led to self-inflicted purges and abandoned positions. American doctrine separated combat from influence operations, relying on leaflets or broadcasts for morale effects. The Australians integrated them seamlessly, using the battlefield as a canvas for subtle messaging that aligned with local cultural nuances, without crossing into excess. This fusion of stealth, insight, and strategy drew quiet admiration and caution from U.S. counterparts. Navy SEALs, for instance, sought SAS guidance on hunting backwards, a technique of tracing fresh signs retrograde to pinpoint origins, tripling their own efficiency in joint efforts like Operation Deacon in 1967. Yet, broader integration stalled. Legal reviews flagged gray areas in rules of engagement, while political sensitivities loomed. Adopting these methods risked scrutiny from Congress or the media, challenging the narrative of American technological supremacy. The report's advice? Maintain separation, observe selectively, but avoid full emulation. On the ground, this translated to those unspoken choices, like the mess hall exodus, a self-imposed barrier to preserve operational purity. As Kowalski reflected years later, that day exposed a fundamental truth: not all paths to victory were equal. The Australians had forged one so attuned to the war's essence that it outpaced even the mightiest arsenal. But it demanded a mindset shift, a surrender to isolation and precision that reshaped the operator. In garrison, SAS men appeared detached, their bonds forged in function rather than emotion. Post-war, many struggled with reintegration, their heightened vigilance a double-edged legacy. U.S. leadership recognized this toll, opting for doctrines that allowed warriors to return as civilians. The Australians' excellence, while undeniable, highlighted a boundary. Some adaptations endured beyond the battlefield. And as the war dragged on, that realization lingered, a quiet testament to allies who fought not just smarter, but differently, proving that in Vietnam's shadows, silence could conquer where thunder failed. The Australian SAS didn't just survive in Vietnam, they redefined what survival meant. While American units measured success in territory held, enemy bodies counted, and fire support called in, the SAS measured it in silence. Silence that stretched for days, weeks, even months in some operational zones. Silence so complete that Viet Cong commanders began to believe the jungle had turned against them. This wasn't mysticism or superstition. It was calculated psychological dominance achieved through methods so subtle, so patient, that they bordered on the invisible. And that invisibility was the true weapon. Patrols typically consisted of 4 or 5 men, each carrying only what he could move with indefinitely. Lightweight weapons, minimal rations, no heavy packs, no excess ammunition beyond what was needed for one decisive contact. Radios were carried but rarely used, emergency extraction only, and even then, many teams preferred to walk out rather than risk compromising their position with a transmission. Insertion was almost always at last light, deep in secondary jungle or rubber plantations, far from any road or village track. The first 24 hours after landing were spent motionless. Not hiding in the classic sense, but becoming part of the landscape. They listened. They watched. They memorized the jungle's natural cadence, the exact timing of bird calls at dawn, the rhythm of cicadas at dusk, the way wind moved through different layers of canopy. Any deviation, a single missing insect sound, a bird flushing unexpectedly, became a signal. Human presence. Enemy presence. When they finally moved, it was at a pace that would have driven most soldiers mad. A few hundred meters in a full day was considered normal. Every step was deliberate. Boots were chosen or modified to leave impressions indistinguishable from bare Vietnamese feet. Leaves were lifted and replaced rather than crushed. Twigs were bent instead of broken. Hand signals replaced speech entirely. Even breathing was controlled, slow, shallow, never audible beyond arm's length. This wasn't stealth training as taught in American schools, this was behavioral camouflage, the art of making the jungle believe nothing had changed. Tracking elevated their method from discipline to something almost supernatural. Australian operators had absorbed techniques from Aboriginal trackers whose ancestors had read the land for tens of thousands of years. A single blade of grass bent at a specific angle indicated passage within the last few hours. A disturbed spider web at chest height revealed a man's build. Soil compression patterns showed whether the person carried a weapon or supplies. Insect behavior changed around recent movement. Ants avoided fresh footprints, certain beetles scattered differently. An SAS patrol didn't stumble across the enemy. They found him deliberately, often days in advance, and then decided whether engagement was even necessary. Many times, it wasn't. The goal was rarely a firefight. A clean, obvious ambush followed by rapid extraction was often considered a tactical failure because it revealed too much. Instead, they preferred contacts that left questions. Selective eliminations. A tax collector vanishes on a familiar trail, a supply runner disappears between 2 villages, a sentry is found alone with his throat cut and his weapon untouched beside him. No massive assault, no artillery barrage, just one man gone, then another, then another. Over weeks, the pattern created terror without spectacle. Viet Cong documents captured in 1968 and 1969 tell the story in their own frightened words. Regional commanders issued standing orders to avoid all contact with the men who walk like ghosts. Entire units abandoned rubber plantations after discovering the aftermath of a single patrol. Supply routes were rerouted, night movement ceased, tax collection stopped in affected areas. In one documented case, a main force battalion refused to enter a 10 square kilometer zone for over 6 weeks after losing only 3 men to what appeared to be isolated sniper fire. The fear wasn't of dying in battle. It was of dying alone, unseen, without warning, and without knowing why. This psychological erosion was deliberate. Australian patrols would sometimes shadow enemy groups for days, learning routines, identifying key individuals, then striking only the most disruptive targets. The message was clear: we see you, we know you, we can reach you anytime. Survivors began to suspect betrayal within their own ranks. Someone must be informing. Paranoia followed. Accusations flew. Internal executions increased. Cells dismantled themselves faster than any external force could have achieved. American intelligence officers who reviewed these outcomes were stunned by the efficiency. A 5-man patrol had accomplished long-term area denial without occupation, suppression without sustained presence, collapse without decisive confrontation. U.S. doctrine separated kinetic action from psychological operations, leaflets, loudspeakers, civic action programs. The Australians fused the two into something seamless. Every contact became a message written in silence and absence. Yet this effectiveness carried a hidden cost that American leadership recognized immediately. To operate this way required a level of detachment most soldiers could not sustain. SAS operators trained to remain alone for extended periods, to suppress normal emotional responses, to treat killing as a technical task rather than a moral event. Over time, this produced what psychologists later termed a predator mindset, the ability to view human targets not as people, but as quarry to be studied and harvested. It made them extraordinarily lethal, but it also changed them permanently. In garrison at Nui Dat, they were polite, quiet, and oddly distant. Bonds existed, but they were functional rather than expressive. They trusted each other with their lives, yet rarely sought reassurance, confession, or emotional release. Liaison officers from American units noticed the difference immediately. They admired the results, respected the discipline, but sensed the price. Post-war studies of Australian SAS veterans from Vietnam revealed consistent patterns: difficulty reintegrating into civilian life, persistent hypervigilance that never fully switched off, emotional flatness that strained marriages and friendships. Many described feeling permanently out of alignment with normal society. Too alert, too quiet, too removed. This was the line American forces refused to cross. U.S. Special Operations prized effectiveness, but not at the expense of identity. The military wanted elite warriors who could return home and become fathers, husbands, citizens again. The Australian approach worked devastatingly well, but it demanded transformations that did not always reverse. That is why the 1969 MACV assessment was buried in classified annexes. That is why the methods were never formally adopted. That is why Green Berets and SEALs who witnessed the results chose distance over understanding. Back in the Long Bin mess hall that afternoon in 1968, the men who stood up and walked away weren't afraid of the lone Australian soldier. They respected him. And that respect carried a shadow. They recognized what total adaptation looked like, a force so attuned to the war's darkest rhythms that it outmatched even the most powerful military on Earth. But they also saw the cost. Some forms of excellence require leaving pieces of yourself behind, pieces that may never come back. The empty seats that day told a story no official report would ever capture fully. A story about allies who fought a different war, one that worked frighteningly well. A war won not with thunder and steel, but with patience, silence, and an unflinching willingness to become the jungle itself. In the end, the most terrifying thing about the Australian SAS wasn't what they did to the enemy. It was what they had to become to do it. And that truth, more than any body count or kill ratio, is why even America's finest chose to leave the table.